Hey everyone. Tonight we opened a dossier on a harbor rebuild deal that was sold as a rescue and filed like a routine purchase order. You probably want to believe how fast recovery can become a money trail with no fingerprints. But you and I are awake at the hour when paperwork stops sounding harmless. If you want more cases like this, tap like, subscribe, and stay with the channel. Keep the lights low. You step into the room with rain on your collar and harbor wind still caught in your seams. The desk lamp throws a hard circle onto the wood. Everything beyond it turns into shadow, the kind that forgives sloppy thinking. I set the evidence object in the light first, a swollen agency envelope, heavy with copied records and the faint smell of toner and salt. A stamped date is smeared, and the corner is dog-eared, like it was opened in a car, then shut when someone realized what they were holding. Across the front, a tracking number, the words, records, response, and nothing else personal. You spill it out. An emergency declaration memo, a procurement notice, a contract summary, meeting minutes where people become titles, a change order log with neat columns, a stack of invoices printed in a gray that feels intentional. Several pages carry thick black bars, redacted, not missing by accident, missing by choice. Because this is a real dossier, we don't invent villains. We don't turn suspicion into accusations. We stay with what the public paperwork can show: dates, signatures, amounts, and process. That S, how you start a cold case. When the crime scene is a budget line, you build a timeline anyway, because money moves in sequences. The first date is the morning after the storm, the kind that makes seawalls look like suggestions. The city declares an emergency. The memo hits the usual notes: public safety, economic necessity, critical infrastructure, rapid mobilization. The harbor is the lifeline, and that part is true. The procurement notice comes next, and it reads like an apology for speed, emergency authority, shortened bid windows, limited competition, accelerated approvals. None of this proves wrongdoing. It proves a door has been left open on purpose, because the city needed action fast. Here's the system insight that sits underneath every disaster contract, even the honest ones. A crisis does not create bad incentives. It concentrates them. Under normal rules, procurement is slow as a form of protection. More bidders means more sunlight. More review means more chances for someone to ask, why this company? Why this price? In an emergency, the guardrails drop. Everyone is rewarded for motion. Reopen the docks, restore the road, show progress to the cameras. Nobody gets applause for saying, pause, this clause is vague. Nobody gets promoted for delaying a rebuild to tighten oversight. So the system tilts, and the people who know how to walk on a slope suddenly look like saviors. You run your finger down the contract summary. Big number, broad scope, flexible language that sounds responsible until you read it twice. As needed, unforeseen conditions, time and materials expedited. A contract like that can be a lifeline. It can also be a corridor where accountability thins as the project grows. Then you pick up the change order log, and the rhythm starts. Change orders are normal. Water ruins plans. Soil shifts. Old drawings lie, but patterns tell stories. Original amount, then additions. Small at first, each justified with words nobody can argue against. Safety, stability, compliance. A dozen modest increases can become a new total without ever triggering the kind of public attention a single giant increase would. The rebuild turns into a moving target, and moving targets are harder to audit. You flip an invoice into the light. Labor hours, equipment rates, mobilization, standby. Language that can be accurate and still hide waste. Because standby can mean waiting responsibly or billing politely. You check the vendor name. You check the billing address. It matches the invoice, but not quite what you expected from public listings. That's not proof. Companies move. Paper trails can be messy for boring reasons. But in a cold case, small mismatches are how the story first clears its throat. Outside the window, the city sleeps under wet streetlights. The harbor itself is a black surface, indifferent to budgets and elections. Deals are not indifferent. Deals care about incentives, and incentives cast long shadows. You look down at the desk. Dates, signatures that repeat, black bars where sentences should be, and a timeline that's already trying to wriggle free. So we start with one pocket-sized question, the kind that keeps you awake after the lamp clicks off. If this rebuild was urgent, necessary, and righteous, why does the money trail already feel like it learned how to run? You don't start the next step by chasing villains. You start by reading the story they want you to repeat. I pull a second evidence object into the lamp S circle and let it sit there like it owns the desk. A glossy progress report booklet, the kind printed on thick paper so it feels expensive even when it's free. The corners are too sharp for something that's been handled by ordinary people. There's a faint crease down the middle like it was folded once, slipped into a jacket, then remembered at the last second. It smells like fresh ink and conference rooms. On the back, a stapled packet of press releases, each one dated, each one signed off by a communications office that understands how hope travels faster than facts. You flip the first page, and the tone is immediate. Not information, reassurance, not questions, answers. A narrative with its sleeves rolled up, swift action, historic investment, jobs protected, commerce restored. The harbor becomes a symbol, not a construction site. And symbols don't get audited the way invoices do. You set the booklet beside the change order log from last night, and you feel the difference in weight. The log is thin, patient, numeric. The booklet is fat with adjectives. One is a timeline of events. The other is a timeline of feelings. The official story begins with the storm, because storms make a clean origin. The next beat is decisive leadership, because decisive leadership photographs well. Then a rapid award, because speed reads like competence. Then the unprecedented partnership, because partnership implies shared responsibility. The last page is always the same. An image of the future, written as if it already happened. I've seen this kind of language before, in cases that later became cold case files on the shelves of the public record. Not because every optimistic press release is a lie. Because optimism is useful. It keeps businesses from fleeing. It keeps the public calm. It keeps the next election from turning into a referendum on rubble. And that's the point where your investigation turns practical. Here's the system insight hiding under the shine. In a crisis, success becomes a performance metric first and a reality second. When the harbor is down, every day costs money in visible ways. Trucks reroute, ships divert, workers go idle. News cameras arrive hungry. Officials are graded on momentum. Reopened by Friday is a sentence that wins applause. We tightened oversight to prevent cost inflation is a sentence that gets you blamed for the delay. So the system incentivizes what looks like progress. It doesn't require corruption. It doesn't require a secret meeting in a dark restaurant. It just requires human beings inside institutions reacting to pressure the way human beings always do. They choose the outcome that reduces immediate pain. Then they justify the process later, if there's time. You turn the press packet over and start reading it like a detective, not a citizen. Release 1 announces emergency authority, frames it as protection. Release 2 highlights a short list of qualified partners, but doesn't explain how the shortlist was built. Release 3 celebrates the award, but uses language that's careful about the price. Not cost, but investment. Not expense, but commitment. Release 4 analysis Phase 1 complete, then slides past what Phase 1 actually means. Then you reach the page with the first redacted block. It's in a public-facing memo attached to the packet, and the black bars look almost embarrassed, like someone tried to hide them behind formatting. It's not a smoking gun. It's a signal. There was a sentence somebody didn't want repeated. You lay it flat and trace the edges of the redaction with your fingertip. The paper is smooth, but the ink is thick. There's a physicality to concealment when it's printed, like the document itself is complicit. You ask the simplest question first. What kinds of details get redacted in these situations? Sometimes it's personal information. Sometimes it's security-related infrastructure details. Sometimes it's ongoing negotiation. Sometimes it's legal advice. All legitimate categories. But even legitimate categories can become convenient. Board redaction can hide narrow discomfort. So you don't declare motives. You build the timeline. You line up the press releases with the meeting minutes, and you notice something subtle. The public narrative moves in clean leaps. Storm, decision, contract, progress. The internal paperwork moves in smaller steps. Approvals, sub-approvals, delegated authority, attachments, references to other references. The public story is a straight road. The internal story is a hallway with many doors, most of them closed. That's where the money trail usually begins. Not in a bag of cash, but in complexity. A complex process creates shadows naturally. Most people don't read procurement notices. Fewer people can decode them. And when the public can't decode the system can claim it is being transparent while still being effectively unreadable. Transparency becomes a technical condition, not a meaningful one. You take a pen and write a plain language translation in the margin of your notes, because plain language is a weapon in a bureaucracy. Emergency procurement means fewer bidders. Fewer bidders means less price pressure. Less price pressure means wider tolerances. Wider tolerances mean more room for change orders. More change orders mean a larger total with a smaller headline. And a smaller headline means the official story stays intact. You don't need to assume anyone plotted it. This is how incentives function in practice. The slope does the work. Still, you feel the tug of a question you can ignore. If the rebuild is a miracle, why do the documents keep asking you not to look too closely? You stack the glossy booklet on the left side of the desk and the raw records on the right. It looks like two versions of the same night. One designed to soothe, one designed to survive scrutiny. Between them is the gap where the case lives. You lean back, listen to the rain tap the window, and let the harbor sit in your mind like a dark shape out beyond the streetlights. The official story is polished, persuasive, and probably not entirely false. But a cold case doesn't begin with a lie. It begins with the first time the timeline stops matching the tone. And tonight, your job is to find that mismatch, name it, and keep following it until the shadow runs out of places to hide. You learn early that the cleanest crimes wear the cleanest suits. Tonight, you don't chase rumors. You chase the moment the rebuild stopped being a civic scramble and started behaving like a pre-written ending. I slide the evidence object into the lamp's circle, a bid tabulation sheet. Photocopied so many times, the grid lines have gone soft at the edges. Someone has highlighted one row in pale yellow, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves the answer is obvious. The page is stapled to an evaluation summary with polite language and a few initials that look like they were added in a hurry. No names here, titles, departments, the kind of anonymity that keeps a system running even when individuals rotate out. You look at the date. It sits uncomfortably close to the emergency declaration. The timeline feels compressed, not impossible, just tight enough that it would reward whoever already had their documents ready, their compliance boxes pre-checked, their subcontractors on speed dial. The tabulation has 3 columns that matter: bidders, base price, responsive status. And then you see it. Not a dramatic gap, not a smoking crater, something quieter, more revealing. The field is thin. 2 bidders, maybe 3. Depending on how you count an incomplete submission. In a project this size, under normal conditions, you'd expect a crowd. Even if half the firms don't want the risk, you still expect more than a couple of names circling a billion-dollar shoreline like cautious birds. But emergencies change the shape of the market. They don't just speed things up. They decide who can keep up. You read the procurement notice again, the fine print that no one reads except competitors and auditors. Shortened window, mandatory site visit with limited scheduling. Insurance requirements that are reasonable but expensive. Bonding capacity thresholds that favor large incumbents. Demonstrated experience with comparable maritime infrastructure. A phrase that sounds like common sense until you realize it's also a gate. This is where the system insight lives, and it's not glamorous. Procurement can be engineered to look open while remaining functionally closed. You don't need to forge documents to steer an outcome. You adjust friction. Add a requirement that only a few companies can meet quickly. Set a deadline that rewards whoever already had a template. Demand a credential that's standard, but only standard for a narrow club. In a crisis, those adjustments get justified as safety, reliability. We can't risk an untested vendor, and the public nods, because the public wants the docs open. The evaluation summary uses familiar words: best value, capacity, proven track record. It claims a method, but it doesn't show the math. The scoring details are not here. Either they were never included in the release, or they were removed, redacted, or simply omitted. Both can be legal. Both can also be convenient. You sit with the sheet and let your instincts do what they do at 2 a.m. You look for repetition. The same vendor name appears not only as prime contractor, but also in the subcontractor list on another page. That's not automatically wrong. Big firms carry networks. But then you spot something else. A consulting firm attached to project management oversight that shares a mailing address with an entity in the vendor ecosystem. Again, addresses overlap for boring reasons all the time. Shared office suites, registered agents, administrative services. In a real dossier, you don't turn overlap into an accusation. You turn it into a question, because questions are safe. Questions are honest. Questions make systems uncomfortable. Why was the bid field so thin? Why were the scoring details not fully present in the released packet? Why do the same supporting names show up in multiple roles? And why does the paper keep insisting the winner was inevitable? You pull out the meeting minutes. They're the kind that say a lot while saying nothing. Discussion held. Consensus reached. Motion carried. Then you find the line about delegated authority, which is procurement's quiet cousin to emergency powers. It's the mechanism that moves decisions from a room full of eyes to a smaller room with fewer questions. You feel the shadow of the incentive structure again. Decision-makers in crisis are not rewarded for exploring alternatives. They're rewarded for selecting a vendor who can start tomorrow. The vendor who can start tomorrow is usually the vendor who already knows the hallways, already understands the procurement language, already has a relationship with the local ecosystem of approvals. Relationship does not equal corruption, but relationship does equal advantage. And advantage, when combined with urgency, becomes a money trail with a polite smile. You check the responsive column. One competitor is marked non-responsive due to a technical deficiency, missing form, wrong attachment, late addendum, acknowledgement. The kind of error that can happen when the process is rushed. Addenda are issued quickly, and smaller firms scramble to keep up. You flip the page and find the addendum list. There were multiple addenda. Each one is a small change that, in practice, can scramble a bidder's internal approvals. A small firm has to call their insurer, their bonding agent, their subcontractors, their lawyer. A large incumbent calls one person and says, "Use the standard package." The slope again. The system doesn't need a shelf. It leans on its own. Still, you're not satisfied. You take the yellow highlighted row and compare it to the contract summary you already have. The language matches, the scope matches, the winner's number is there, but there is a detail in the fine print of the award notice that makes your pen stop. Initial term, it says, with optional extensions and additional task authorizations as required. Optional extensions, task authorizations. That's where a deal becomes elastic. That's where the headline amount becomes a starting point, not a ceiling. That's where change orders stop being exceptions and start becoming the main engine. The official story will always point to the original award as proof of discipline. The money trail usually lives in what follows. You sit back and listen to the rain, and you imagine the meeting where someone said, "We'll lock in the base contract now and handle the rest through task orders. No conspiracy needed. Just a strategy that feels efficient to insiders and opaque to everyone else." In a cold case, you always mark the first moment the decision became difficult to reverse. This feels like one of those moments. Not because you can prove wrongdoing, but because you can prove design. And design is what systems hide behind when people ask for accountability. You put the bid tabulation sheet on the desk and stare at the thin list of competitors until it starts to look like an empty street at closing time. Not a smoking gun. A quiet street. Pie and a single set of footprints, already headed toward the water. You don't chase a case like this by staring harder at totals. Totals are loud. The truth prefers smaller sounds. Tonight, you chase minutes. I bring the evidence object into the lamp S cone and set it down with the careful weight of something that hates daylight. A batch of email headers printed from a records response, clipped together with a bent paperclip that's starting to rust. No bodies, just the top lines, timestamps, sender fields reduced to departments, subject lines that look like they were strangled mid-sentence. Several entries are redacted so aggressively the page feels bruised. It's a strange kind of cruelty, giving you a skeleton and calling it transparency. You smooth the pages with your palm and start building your timeline the way you always do. The way a cold case gets warmed up. You stop trusting the story and start trusting the clock. First email. Emergency procurement initiated. Time, early morning, the day after the storm. Second email. Rebuild scope alignment, sent to a distribution list that reads like a miniature. Government, legal, finance, procurement, engineering, communications. Everyone with a reason to say yes and a reason to say no. All invited into the same thread, so responsibility can be shared like a blanket. Third email. Addendum drafted. Fourth addendum issued. Fifth acknowledgement requested. Sixth acknowledgement received. Then, right in the middle, you find it. A gap, not hours, minutes. A tight stretch where the process should be loudest, but the record goes quiet. You see a header that says call summary, and the entire subject line is redacted. You see a header that says like a nervous stutter, but the sender field is blanked and the recipients are blacked out. You see a timestamp that suggests urgency, then nothing. Then the next visible header appears, after the decision has effectively already landed. You lean back. The rain taps the glass like a patient metronome. You realize you re-staring at the administrative equivalent of a hallway camera that stops recording exactly when someone passes through. You don't get to call that corruption. In a real dossier, you don't get to do that. But you do get to name the mechanism. Here's the system insight. In bureaucracies, the real decisions often happen before the official meeting. And the official meeting exists to make the decision look like it happened there. It's called pre-briefing, or alignment, or staff work, or getting everyone on the same page. The words change. The function stays. A director calls a deputy. A deputy calls procurement. Procurement calls legal. Legal calls risk. Risk calls insurance. Meanwhile, someone calls the vendor to ask, carefully, what they can mobilize by Monday. None of this needs to be sinister. It can be responsible triage under pressure. But it creates something you can ignore. The record of persuasion becomes thinner than the record of outcome. And thin records are where the shadow lives. You trace the missing minutes on the page with the tip of your pen. Then you cross-reference the times against the meeting minutes you already have. The ones that say discussion held like it's a prayer. The minutes don't tell you who argued for speed. They don't tell you who raised concerns. They don't tell you who said, "We'll handle that later." They don't tell you who suggested moving the messy parts into task authorizations. They tell you that a motion carried. You knew that already. The system knew you'd know that already. You flipped to another sheet from the packet. A routing slip. It's the kind of form that makes decisions feel orderly. A list of approvals, each box with a tiny line where someone's initials become a lever. The boxes are checked. The dates are there. The order is plausible. But the handwriting changes twice. One set of initials is tight and practiced. Another is rushed, slanted, as if signed while standing. And the final approval, the one that matters most, lands with the neatness of someone who has done this so often they could do it blindfolded. You stare at that last date and compare it to the email header gap. The approvals appear to line up, but the persuasion, the pressure, the alignment, the part where the choice becomes inevitable, is missing. That's not an accident of paperwork. It's a feature of how institutions protect themselves. When a deal goes bad years later, people don't get punished for what they privately said. They get punished for what they publicly signed. So systems naturally learn to keep the public record safe and the private record scarce. That's how you get a clean, official timeline and a messy, real one. And that's how a money trail becomes difficult to prove, even when it's easy to suspect. You place the bid tabulation from Section 3 beside these headers. The thin bidder field sits there like a quiet warning. A narrow competition window plus a fast-moving approval chain equals a predictable winner. Predictability can be competence. Predictability can also be steering. The point is, the timeline was built to reward whoever already knew how to move at this speed. You take one of the redacted headers and let it sit in the light longer than it wants. You imagine the sentence behind the black bar, a name, a meeting location, a concern. a workaround. You don't get to invent it, so you do the next best thing. You write down what the redaction does accomplish. Prevents the public from reconstructing who influenced whom. It prevents competitors from understanding how the process unfolded. It prevents auditors from seeing the full chain without subpoena-level authority. It protects the institution from embarrassment, even if it does nothing to protect the public from waste. That's the part that makes your jaw tighten. Not because you've proven a crime, but because you've proven an environment where wrongdoing would have room to breathe. You circle the missing minutes on your timeline chart and label them in plain ink, unaccounted interval. Then you draw arrows forward from that gap to what you already know is coming. Change orders, task authorizations, invoices with soft language, totals that inflate without ever making a single explosive headline. That's where the money trail usually stops looking like a trail and starts looking like weather. You sit there and feel the case get heavier, not with certainty, but with direction. The official narrative told you the harbor was rebuilt by willpower and urgency. Your timeline is beginning to suggest something else. The harbor was rebuilt by a machine that knows how to move quickly when it must, and knows how to keep its most important conversations just outside the record. A cold case doesn't ignite because you find one dramatic clue. It ignites because you realize the paper is teaching you what it refuses to show. And the missing minutes tonight are teaching you that the next redaction won't be a random black bar. It will be a boundary, a line drawn on purpose. You can learn a lot about a system by the way it hides. Not what it hides, the way it hides. The careful wording, the official politeness, the quiet confidence that you will get tired before you get the truth. I put the evidence object down like it's fragile because, in a way, it is. A formal records response letter on thick municipal letterhead, stamped received, stapled to a bundle of attachments that look like they've been through a small war. The staples are slightly bent, as if someone ripped the packet apart, then regretted it and tried to put it back the way it was. In the top right corner, a case number. Under it, a line that always sounds harmless until you been burned by it before. Certain information has been withheld pursuant to applicable exemptions. You read the next sentence and feel it settle in your ribs. Redacted. The black bars are not the frantic kind you see in movies. They're clean, measured, evenly weighted, as if secrecy has its own style guide. Whole paragraphs are missing, but the formatting remains intact, which is its own kind of cruelty. It's a doorway bricked up with fresh mortar, and the agency still expects you to admire the architecture. You turn the pages slowly because you want to understand the boundary, not just bump into it. The letter lists categories: security-sensitive infrastructure details, proprietary commercial information, attorney-client privileged communications, deliberative process materials. The phrases are familiar, and they're not inherently sinister. There are legitimate reasons to withhold specifics about critical infrastructure. There are legitimate reasons to protect certain trade secrets. There are legitimate reasons to keep legal advice confidential. But legitimacy has a second life. It can become a tool. It can become a shield. It can become a reflex. Here's the system insight. And it's the kind you only learn by reading enough of these packets in enough cold cases. Redaction is not only about protecting information. It's about managing risk for the institution. Risk of litigation, risk of embarrassment, risk of exposing internal disagreement, risk of revealing how influence works before decisions become public. Institutions do not redact to satisfy your curiosity. They redact to reduce their liability. So you stop thinking of the black bars as missing words. You start thinking of them as incentives made visible. You take the record's letter and flatten it beside your timeline. December 23rd, 2025, 3:34 a.m. Your last note, unaccounted interval. Then you trace forward to the point in the packet where the redaction thickens, where the ink stops being occasional and starts becoming structural. It happens around scope alignment and vendor communications. You don't have the bodies of the emails. You don't have the attachments. You don't have the notes from the calls. You have headers and approvals and outcomes. The system has left you with the skeleton again. This is the first deliberate boundary of the case, and it doesn't just block you. It tells you exactly where the system believes the risk lives. You pick up one attachment. It's titled like a technical memo. Most of it is blacked out. A few phrases survive like survivors on a lifeboat. Urgent stabilization, accelerated schedule, material constraints, coordination with vendor. It's just enough language to sound responsible, not enough language to be accountable. You set it down and feel the paper drag slightly against the desk, like it doesn't want to be moved. The lamp's heat warms the ink, and the black bars begin to look less like sensor lines and more like shadows you can T-step through. You can't accuse anyone of wrongdoing based on that, not responsibly, not in a real dossier. But you can do something sharper than accusation. You can explain what this boundary does to the public. It turns oversight into an illusion of access. You can see that a conversation happened, but not what was said. You can see that a recommendation was made, but not the reasoning. You can see that a vendor was chosen, but not the competing alternatives that were dismissed, or the internal cautions that were overridden. You can see the timeline of approvals, but not the timeline of persuasion. And persuasion is where the money trail usually gets its shoes on. You flip back to the letter and read the line about deliberative process. It's meant to protect candid internal discussion, so people can speak freely before decisions are final. That's the theory. In practice, it can become a convenient fog machine. If internal debate stays hidden, then the institution can present a unified official story later, even if the decision was contested, rushed, or shaped by pressure. You stare at the black bars and imagine a room where someone said, "We shouldn't do this yet," and someone else said, "We don't have time." That kind of exchange is normal, human, possibly even responsible in the moment. But when it's hidden, it changes what can be proven later. When the project costs swell, when change orders stack, when invoices multiply, the system can point to the public record and say, "We followed process." And the public can't see the internal warnings that might have existed, or the internal compromises that might have been made. A cold case thrives on that asymmetry. The packet includes a small index of what was withheld, not detail, just categories and page counts. That's the part that makes you laugh without humor. Page counts. The system tells you how much you don't get to know, as if quantity is a substitute for truth. You write those counts down anyway, because even the shape of secrecy can be evidence. You notice something else. The redaction is not evenly distributed. It clusters around communications, around rationale, around anything that would show the why. Meanwhile, the hard outcomes remain visible. Contract totals, dates, scope headings, signature blocks. The institution is willing to show you the what. It is reluctant to show you the why. That's not a confession. It's a posture, and postures matter. You lean in and check the black bars for patterns. Some are short, a sentence length. Some are long, entire sections. A few end mid-paragraph, suggesting the redactor started with a legal exemption, then found something else that felt risky, then just kept going. Redaction creep is a real thing. Once secrecy begins, it spreads. You put the records letter back in the center of the desk, and let it be the case S. First, real adversary. Not a person, not a name, a mechanism. Because that's what you're up against here. A system designed to move fast, declare victory, and then keep its vulnerable conversations behind legal curtains. That system might have acted in good faith. It might not have. Your job is to show how the structure itself creates a shadow where motives can hide and money can move. You tap the edge of the letter and feel how steady your own pulse has become. The rain is still there. The harbor is still there. Your timeline is still there, now with a line across it where the record goes dark. The first redaction isn't just a black bar. It's the moment the case stops being about reconstruction and starts being about resistance. And now you know exactly what the machine is afraid you'll see. You learn to respect the first number on a contract the way you respect the first alibi in a cold case. It's useful. It's not the whole truth. Tonight you stop reading the base award like a finish line and start reading it like a doorway. Because the money trail rarely sprints through the front entrance. It prefers the side hall where everything is labeled routine. I place the evidence object under the lamp. A thick change order packet bound with a black binder clipped so tight it has left teeth marks in the paper. The top sheet is a standard form with a familiar title change order request, and a handwritten note in the margin that looks like it was written while standing in a hallway. Need approval ASAP. Schedule impact. The pages underneath are soft from handling corners. Curled coffee rings, dried into pale halos. There's a faint grit between them, like harbor dust got pressed into the fibers. This is not a polished story for the public. This is the working spine of the deal. You flip it open, and the rhythm hits you immediately. Each one has a brief justification, a number, and the same quiet reassurance. Necessary, urgent, reasonable. Each one moves a little more money. Each one moves a little more responsibility away from the original competitive moment and into a quieter phase where fewer people are watching. You scan the signature blocks and feel the pattern before you fully see it. The same initials keep appearing, not proof of wrongdoing, proof of concentration. A handful of people tasked with keeping the harbor alive, end up being the people who also decide what as needed means. Their titles don't say gatekeeper, their workload does. You pull your timeline closer and start marking the change orders by date, because a timeline is the only honest witness you have. The first change order arrives fast, almost impatient. That makes sense in a disaster. The second arrives before the first has even cooled. The third arrives with language that feels pre-baked, like someone already knew this was coming. Then you notice a detail that makes you stop turning pages. The supporting attachments for 2 of the change orders are partially redacted, not entirely, just enough to blur the exact reasoning, the internal calculations, the back and forth that would show whether the amount was derived or simply accepted. The shadow is not in the total, the shadow is in the justification. And that takes you straight into the system insight of this section, the kind you don't hear at press conferences. Change orders are where incentives negotiate in private. On paper, change orders exist to handle reality. Bad weather, hidden damage, supply shortages, shifting regulations, all real. But change orders also create a second marketplace, one that operates after competition has thinned and momentum has become the priority. In that second marketplace, the city's incentive is speed and continuity. Switching contractors midstream is politically painful and operationally risky. It delays reopening. It invites lawsuits. It makes leadership look indecisive. The contractor's incentive is margin and leverage. A base bid can be lean to win. Then the profitable work arrives in additions, revisions, and time and materials, details that are harder for outsiders to price check. That doesn't require fraud. It requires math and a system that rewards progress over interrogation. So the deal becomes elastic. The base contract is what the public remembers. The change order log is what the budget experiences. Return to C002 and read the language about unforeseen site conditions. You've seen it in enough municipal projects to recognize its power. It's hard to argue with, because arguing implies you wanted the harbor to stay broken. If you push back, you become the person slowing recovery. Nobody wants that role. You look at the approval date and compare it to the email header gap you circled earlier. The change order lands right after the period where conversations went dark. That might be coincidence. It might be normal chaos. Or it might be the system doing what it does best, making the decisive discussion happen offstage, then bringing the paperwork out once the direction is set. You do not conclude. You document. You run your finger down the cost breakdown. Labor rates, equipment rates, standby, mobilization, management fee. That last phrase is always interesting. Management is real work. It is also a flexible category, a place where the line between necessary coordination and billable fog can blur. You flip to C003, the material substitution 1. Supply constraints are real. In emergencies, the market gets weird. But substitutions can also change costs in ways that are difficult to compare without the full technical attachments. Those attachments here are partially redacted. Again, maybe legitimate, maybe security, maybe proprietary. But the effect is the same. The public can easily validate the logic of the cost. A cold case doesn't need a confession to form. It needs recurring opacity. You lean back and listen to the rain, and you picture the harbor at night, floodlights, machinery, crews moving like ants along a broken edge. It's easy to respect the urgency. It's also easy to see how urgency becomes a shield. You pick up the change order log and notice how it's formatted to feel controlled. Every entry has a neat description. Every entry has a reason. But the reasons are written in the language of inevitability. Required, necessary, urgent. A vocabulary that reduces debate to sabotage. You underline the same initials appearing again and again, and write a note beside them. Bottleneck. That's not an accusation. It's a structural observation. A bottleneck concentrates power unintentionally. It also concentrates risk. When only a few people can approve, those people become the point where pressure lands. Political pressure, operational pressure, vendor pressure, public pressure. Sometimes they hold firm. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they compromise in ways that seem small in the moment and enormous in hindsight. And that's the part that keeps you awake. The difference between compliance and integrity can be as thin as a deadline. You set the binder-clipped packet back into the lamp S circle and stare at the numbers like they re a tide chart. The tide always comes in. The question is whether anyone bothered to build a seawall for the budget. You mark C001 through C004 on your timeline and draw a line forward into the dark space you havened. T reached yet, the space where optional extensions and task authorizations live. The money trail isn't loud yet, but it's moving. And it's moving through paperwork that looks ordinary enough for the shadow to pass as routine. Emergencies don't just break infrastructure. They breed paperwork, extra hands, extra titles. You've watched the base contract swell through change orders. Now you watch the rebuild sprout a halo of support, advice, and oversight. Each word soft, each invoice hard. I slide the evidence object into the lamp's circle. A professional services agreement, stapled to a stack of monthly invoices. The pages are crisp at the top and smudged at the edges, handled in a hurry. Someone has underlined a clause so aggressively the paper fibers look bruised. Time and materials, not to exceed. The number after it is high enough to be respectable and low enough to avoid headlines. You flip an invoice. Hours by role. Senior advisor, program manager, stakeholder liaison, compliance specialist. It reads like a cast list for a play where nobody wants top billing. The total is calm, almost soothing, until you realize there's a second invoice behind it, and a third, month after month, like rain. The contract title calls it Independent Project Oversight. That word, independent, is a charm people say out loud when they're thinking about the next audit. You put the consultant invoices beside your change order packet and compare language the way you compare alibis. The scope includes change order review, schedule recovery, risk mitigation, and coordination with prime contractor. None of that is automatically wrong. Complex projects need extra expertise. but you feel responsibility begin to smear. If a change order is questioned, who answers? The contractor who benefits, the city staff who signed under pressure, or the consultant who reviewed and recommended, whose work might never be fully public? Here's the system insight. Consultants don't just provide expertise, they provide insulation. City staff are exposed, their names attached to decisions. They face public records, requests, and political blowback. Consultants are buffered. They advise and document and support, while accountability remains technically elsewhere. When the project succeeds, the consultant helped deliver. When it stumbles, their work becomes one input among many, and the reasoning can vanish behind exemptions, confidentiality clauses, or pages that arrive redacted. You find the first clue that this isn't just help, it's a layer. One line item. Change order analysis. 18 hours. The date matches C002. Another, contractor coordination call. Another, draft memo to procurement. The memo itself isn't in your packet. Maybe it wasn't requested. Maybe it was withheld as deliberative. Either way, the timeline shows a bridge forming between the vendor and the people who approve payments. You don't call it collusion. In a real dossier, you don't get to. You call it proximity, and you write it down. Then you notice how the constellation grows. Separate invoices from a public relations vendor, an environmental compliance shop, a community outreach contractor, each billed under a narrow scope, each justified by urgency, each small enough to feel like a rounding error next to the prime contract. That's the second function of the constellation: fragmentation. Big spending doesn't always arrive as one big check. Sometimes it arrives as 20 reasonable checks, especially with professional services, where the deliverable is a meeting, a dashboard, a recommendation. You can't point at a seawall and say, "That hour built this." You can only point at a decision and the shadow that decision casts. You flip to a meeting attendance list attached to the oversight invoices. It's long: steering committee, vendor alignment, permitting coordination. One entry is partially blacked out. The same clean bars you've seen before. The same boundary around the conversations that make the payments feel inevitable. Now your cold case questions sharpen. If the city needed independent oversight, why is so much of the oversight's reasoning missing from the record? If the oversight is truly independent, why does its workflow sit so close to vendor coordination and internal approvals? If the rebuild is being managed transparently, why do the same redacted shadows keep forming around alignment and risk mitigation? The exact places where a money trail learns how to walk without leaving prints. You mark consultant layer begins on your timeline and draw arrows from invoice dates to change order approvals, then to press release dates. You've seen this marriage before. The public story needs the internal schedule, and the internal schedule needs the public story. Momentum becomes its own deliverable. The rain keeps time against the glass. The harbor keeps its own time, indifferent. Your desk keeps a third kind of time, measured in paper, and what the paper refuses to say. You close the services agreement and feel the staples scratch your thumb. A tiny pain, a useful reminder. This is how a deal protects itself, not with one secret, but with layers of professionalism stacked until responsibility becomes hard to grab. And as you trace the money trail through those layers, you feel the case leave the world of construction and enter the world of governance, where the cleanest language can hide the ugliest incentives. A system rarely says, "We buried your complaint." It says, "Your complaint has been resolved." And it says it in a tone that makes resolution sound like mercy. You pull the next file from the stack and feel the temperature of it before you even read it. I set the evidence object under the desk lamp, a thin manila folder labeled in blocky pen, "Bid Protest," with a date stamp that looks like it struck hard enough to bruise the paper. Inside, a formal letter on a competitor's letterhead. The edges are worn like it was folded, unfolded, and refolded by someone who couldn't decide whether to fight or survive. There's a faint smell of cologne and copier heat, and one corner has a shallow coffee stain. The kind you get when you're awake too long, trying to write something polite while your hands want to shake. You read the opening line, and it's careful, not angry. Strategic, they assert, standing. They reference the solicitation number. They request corrective action. They mention the compressed timeline, the addenda, the evaluation criteria that were unclear or inconsistently applied. There's no wild allegation here. Just a professional complaint that knows it must sound reasonable to be heard at all. You flip to the attachment list. Bid, submission, confirmation. Addendum, acknowledgements. A screenshot of the procurement portal timestamp. A request for a debrief. A note about a technical deficiency that rendered them non-responsive. That phrase again, non-responsive, the bureaucratic equivalent of a locked door. You place the protest letter beside the bid tabulation sheet and feel the cold case shift. This isn't just you reading records in the dark. This is someone else trying to stop the train while it was still moving. And then you find the second document in the folder. The response. It's shorter, cleaner, written in the voice of a system that has answered this kind of letter 1,000 times. It acknowledges receipt. It cites the rules. It explains that emergency conditions justify accelerated procurement. It states, calmly, that the protest does not meet the standard for relief. You look for the sentence that ends it. You find it near the bottom, printed like a closing eyelid. No further action will be taken. The protest dies in one paragraph, and the harbor keeps rebuilding as if the challenge never existed. Here, the system insight that makes protest processes feel like shouting into weather. Bid challenges are often constrained by design. Not because oversight is fake, but because the institution fears delay more than it fears doubt. In a crisis, delay has a measurable cost. The public sees it. Businesses feel it. Officials get blamed for it. So the incentives align against anything that slows momentum, even legitimate review. The rules narrow what can be argued, how quickly it must be argued, and what evidence is required to win. Technicalities become decisive because technicalities are fast. They are easier than reopening competition, easier than admitting the process was rushed, easier than rewriting the official story. You read the denial again and notice how it uses the law like a blanket. Discretion. emergency authority, administrative burden. It is not necessarily wrong. It is complete in the way a door is complete. Then you notice the third paper, tucked behind the denial. An email printout, mostly headers, with several lines redacted. It references a withdrawal. It mentions a mutual understanding. The recipients are blacked out. The subject line is partially censored. The timestamps are visible, though, and you do what you always do. You build the timeline. Complaint filed. Response issued. Request for debrief. Then a gap, your old friend. Then a final email. Protest withdrawn. You circle the gap and feel the shadow deepen, because withdrawals do not happen in a vacuum. Sometimes they happen because the protester realizes they truly made a fatal submission error. Sometimes they happen because the legal cost outweighs the chance of winning. Sometimes they happen because the project is moving so fast that even a victory would come too late to matter. And sometimes, in systems like this, withdrawals happen because someone offers a quiet off-ramp, not necessarily a bribe. That's not a claim you can make here. An off-ramp can be as simple as, "We'll consider you for sub-work," or "We'll invite you to the next bid," or "We can't change the past, but we can reduce your future pain." The effect is what matters to your investigation, because the effect shapes what the public ever learns. A challenge evaporates, and the record contains a polite tombstone. You flip through the folder again and find a page titled Debrief Summary. It's heavily redacted. Whole sections are gone. Only a few phrases survive, like bones after fire. Insufficient documentation, mandatory requirement, deadline compliance, non-negotiable. The irony is almost tender. The one meeting designed to explain the decision is the one most aggressively hidden. You write down what you can prove from the public record. A protest existed. It raised concerns about process under an accelerated timeline. It was denied or neutralized through procedural framing. It was withdrawn. The debrief is redacted. That's all. That's enough. Because in a cold case, what matters is not only what the system did, but how the system trained everyone watching to behave next time. If protests are quickly dismissed, if explanations are withheld, competitors learn a lesson. They stop fighting. They stop investing in challenges. They either accept the system or try to join its ecosystem. And joining an ecosystem is where your money trail starts to braid into the subcontractor world. The place where losers can become winners again, quietly, under someone else's umbrella. You look at the names on the protest letter, and then at the subcontractor list you glimpsed in earlier documents. You don't see a match yet, not clearly. But you feel the next section approaching like footsteps in a hallway. Because once a protest dies quietly, the rebuild can continue loudly. Press releases, photo ops, progress. Meanwhile, beneath the official story, the incentives keep working. The paperwork keeps multiplying. And the shadow stays comfortably between technically compliant and publicly understandable. You close the manila folder, and it makes a soft slap on the desk, like a book ending without a moral. The harbor outside is still there. Rebuilt or not, it's a place where water hides what sinks. And this protest on your desk is the first thing that tried to float. It didn't. You don't lose a fortune in one dramatic transfer. You lose it in crumbs that never look like a meal. I pull the evidence object into the lamp's circle and let it fan out across the desk. A printed subcontractor schedule with a faint grid, the kind that started life as a spreadsheet before someone decided paper feels more official. It's stapled to a stack of purchase orders and pay application cover sheets. The ink is uneven in places, like the printer was running low right when the numbers got interesting. A few vendor IDs are redacted, not the names, not always. The identifiers, the parts that let you match entities across databases without guessing. You read it top to bottom, and it starts like a normal construction ecosystem: demolition, dredging, concrete, steel, electrical, environmental monitoring, security, traffic control. Then it keeps going. A temporary services firm, a materials testing lab, a logistics coordinator, a stakeholder engagement vendor, a marine wildlife observer. Each line has a scope phrase, an amount, a start date, and a column labeled tier. That tier column is the first thing that makes your pen pause. Tier 1 means the prime hires them directly. Tier 2 means the prime hires someone who hires them. Tier 3 means the money trail has already learned to speak in echoes. And this is a cold case lesson you can feel in your teeth. The deeper the tiers, the harder it is for the public to track where value ends and markup begins. You pick up a purchase order and read the scope line. It's short. Additional debris haul-off. Another. Weekend crane standby. Another. Emergency fencing expansion. All of it sounds plausible. All of it might be real. But you see how the shuffle works, not as a crime, as a structure. Because the subcontractor's schedule is not just a list of workers. It's a map of how the project's accountability gets diluted. Here's the system insight, the one that procurement manuals never say out loud. Subcontracting can be used to distribute work or to distribute opacity. When a prime contractor holds the headline award, the public attention sticks to that prime. The press releases name one company. The ribbon-cutting photos frame one logo, if any logo is shown at all. But the actual spending becomes a river delta. Small channels, many mouths, fewer people watching each stream. And that matters because oversight resources are finite. Auditors can T-chase every $48,000 purchase order with the intensity they would chase a $480 million award. Review thresholds exist. Approval layers change based on amount. The system is built that way because it has to be. The side effect is predictable. Breaking work into smaller parts can keep the project moving while keeping scrutiny shallow. You don't have to prove anyone intended that. You just have to show how easily it can happen. You look at the pay applications, the documents that summarize what the contractor claims was completed and what they are owed this month. Each one has a schedule of values, a list of categories with percent complete numbers that look scientific until you remember they often start as estimates. Harbor wall stabilization, 42%. Dock utilities, 18%. Debris removal, 100%. 100% is always worth staring at. You match the debris removal line to a cluster of purchase orders, and you find something that feels like a trick you've seen before. The same scope described 3 ways across 3 documents. One PO calls it debris haul-off. Another calls it material disposal and transport. A third calls it site clearing. Support. Different vendors. Similar windows of time. Similar amounts. Maybe it's legitimate. Different work packages. Different sites. Different constraints. But the language is flexible. And flexible language is where the shadow likes to sit. You turn to the tear column again. Some of these vendors are Tier 2 and Tier 3. That means the city is paying the prime. The prime is paying a subcontractor, the subcontractor is paying another subcontractor, and by the time the money reaches the hands doing the actual work, it has passed through markups, coordination fees, and management costs that are not always visible in a public packet. Again, not automatically wrongdoing. It's how big jobs run. But it's also how a money trail can lengthen without anyone needing to forge a single line. You take out your notebook and start a simple exercise that makes systems nervous. You build a mini timeline of one scope item, end to end. Scope: emergency fencing expansion. Day 1. Change order, justification, mentions public safety perimeter. Day 2. Consultant invoice, lists risk mitigation. Coordination. Day 4. Prime issues a purchase order to vendor a Day 6. Vendor A issues a sub-purchase order to vendor B, Tier 2. Day 14. Pay application claims perimeter work 100% complete. Day 20. Press packet mentions enhanced safety measures now in place. It's clean, it's efficient. It's also hard to audit from the outside, because the crucial details sit inside private contracts between private parties, and your records packet only sees the surfaces. You noticed the redactions again. Not whole names, not always. The identifiers, the banking details, the exact unit rates in a couple of attachments. Those might be legitimate exemptions for privacy and proprietary terms, but the effect is the same as it's been all night. You can see the outline of movement without the fine-grained texture that proves whether the movement was fair. You keep your discipline. You don't accuse. You describe. Then you find the page that changes your posture. In the chair, a vendor list with addresses, partially obscured, and a note that certain vendors are registered agents or administrative offices. A few share the same suite number. That can happen for boring reasons. Lots of firms use the same corporate services address. But it's also the kind of thing you flag, because it can indicate a cluster, an ecosystem, a set of entities that are separate on paper and connected in practice. You underline suite and write possible network. Verify later. The harbor wind presses against the window, and you feel the narrative pressure building too. The official story wants one hero vendor and one clean rebuild. Your desk is filling with a more complicated truth. A rebuild executed through a maze of tiers where accountability thins as the paperwork multiplies. That's the ugly picture coming into focus. Not necessarily a single villain. A structure where speed is rewarded, fragmentation is normal, and the public record is redacted precisely where it would help ordinary people understand what their money actually bought. You stack the subcontractor schedule on top of the pay applications, and you feel the case lean forward, impatient. Because now the question isn't just who won the award. It's who kept getting paid, and through how many hands, and why. The timeline was designed to make that hard to follow. By the time you reach the docks, the paper has already decided what it wants to be. Out there, under floodlights and drizzle, the harbor isn't a narrative. It's cold metal, wet rope, diesel breath, and men and women moving fast because slow work gets people hurt. The storm tore things open. The rebuild stitched it back together with overtime and urgency. And if you want the truth, you don't start with the press releases. You start with the people who touched the bolts. They don't want to talk, not because they don't know anything, because they know exactly what talking costs. I bring the evidence object into the lamp-s circle, and it looks like it's been living in a pocket for days. A small, spiral notepad page, torn along the perforation, stained with rust-colored smears and rain freckles. In the corner, a handwritten list of shift times and vehicle numbers. Below that, 3 words written with a heavier press. Like the pen got angry, same trucks again, and under it a line that makes your timeline sit up in its chair. Pickup slips say different company, same address, suite _. The suite number is missing, either never written or scraped away. But the phrase same address sits there like a nail you can stop touching with your tongue. It matches your earlier note from the vendor list, the shared suite numbers, the partial redactions around identifiers. You don't know who wrote this. You don't know why they handed it over. You only know it ended up on your desk. And that's how the best cold case files start. A small object with big intent. You think about the conversations you tried to have, the ones that turned into polite dead ends. A foreman who keeps his answers short and looks past you to the gate. A driver who says, "I just followed dispatch," like dispatch is weather. A safety coordinator who smiles too much and repeats policy words until you stop asking. A clerk in a trailer office who tells you records are handled downtown, as if the timeline belongs to another species. You can't name them. You won't. Real dossier rules. No doxing, no personal accusations you can't prove. You stay in the realm of mechanisms and incentives, because those are real, even when people won't be. And tonight, the mechanism is silence. Here's the system insight, the one that explains why the money trail can exist in plain sight, while the people closest to it refuse to describe it. In contracted public work, the strongest enforcement tool isn't always law. It's future access. Workers depend on shifts. Small vendors depend on being called back. Subcontractors depend on staying in good standing with primes and on pre-qualification lists that can quietly exclude them next season. Even when whistleblower protections exist on paper, retaliation is often softer than a firing. Fewer hours, a colder shoulder, a sudden "we don't need you on this site anymore," a phone that stops ringing. And because the rebuild is framed as urgent, anyone who questions it can be painted as an obstacle to recovery. That pressure doesn't need to be spoken aloud. It hangs in the air like harbor fog. People breathe it until it feels normal. You see it in the way questions make eyes flick to supervisors. You hear it in the way answers become generic. I don't handle billing. That's above me. Talk to procurement. Everything's documented. Then the paperwork arrives redacted, and the shadow grows between what's documented and what's knowable. The notepad page under your lamp is the opposite of that. It's not official. It's not polished. It's the kind of thing a person writes when they've noticed a pattern but doesn't have a safe place to say it out loud. Same trucks again. You turn the page over. There's a half-print of a logo from the sheet it was torn from, and a faint impression of another note beneath it, like a ghost of pressure. Don't use my name. That's the part that makes the room feel colder, even with the lamp. You pull the subcontractor schedule back into view and pick one scope item. Something mundane and frequent. Hauling, disposal, material transport. You trace the vendor names. Some are familiar, some are new. Some are one letter off from each other, as if branding itself is a mask that can be changed cheaply. You compare it to the pay application categories. The same scope is described in different language across different documents. That's normal in a chaotic rebuild. It's also the exact condition in which a substitute company name on a pickup slip can slide through without triggering alarms. Same trucks, different company. You do what you always do. You anchor it to the timeline. When did hauling spike? Right after C001 and C002. When did consultant hours spike? During risk mitigation coordination. When did the protest get withdrawn? In the gap. When did the vendor list show shared addresses? In the packet that arrived with identifiers redacted. The case is beginning to behave like a machine. Urgency creates speed. Speed creates complexity. Complexity creates plausible deniability. And plausible deniability creates silence. You imagine the worker who wrote the note, not a hero, not a whistleblower in a movie, just someone who saw the same trucks roll in, saw different names on the slips, and thought, this is either a paperwork mistake or a trick, and then thought, either way, if I'm the one who says it, I'm the one who gets punished. The harbor has its own language for punishment. It's not dramatic. It's hours lost, bills unpaid, a kid's shoes delayed, rent late, the slow violence of economic consequence. You tap the notepad page with your finger and feel the edge of a larger story pressing up beneath it. The address, the shared suite, the same trucks. A vendor network that might be nothing, or might be the hidden plumbing behind the rebuild's glossy miracle. You don't jump, you don't accuse, you mark it as a lead, because the pivot is coming. And you can feel it in the way the case keeps circling the same place. Addresses, registration details, identifiers that vanish behind redaction. And the quiet fact that the people closest to the work would rather swallow truth than become the next obstacle in the official story. You slide the notepad page into the center of the desk where the lamp can ignore it. And you realize something ugly and simple. If the only people who can confirm the money trail are afraid to speak, then the timeline will have to speak for them. And that means the next clue won't be a confession. It will be paperwork that forgot to hide one important detail. The thing about a cold case is that it doesn't always crack with a scream. Sometimes it cracks with an address. You've been tracing the money trail through tears, invoices, change orders, and conversations that go redacted right when the air gets interesting. You've watched your timeline develop soft spots, little unaccounted intervals where decisions seem to happen off the record and then reappear as signatures. Now the case gives you a single, stubborn coordinate, a point on the map where too many lines intersect. I slide the evidence object into the lamp circle, and it looks almost innocent. A printout from a state corporate registry. The kind of page you can pull in a minute if you know where to look. It's slightly curled at the corners, punched with 2 holes like it once lived in a binder. There's a faint watermark across the center. A filing stamp sits at the top, crisp as a judge's gavel. Someone has stuck a yellow note on the margin with one word written in block letters: Sweet. The entity name is unremarkable. That's the point. It's built to be forgettable. A vendor from your subcontractor schedule, not the prime contractor, not a public figure. Just one of the many small mouths in the river delta of spending. You read the line that matters. Registered office address, a street, a building, a suite. You feel the room change without any sound, because you've seen that suite before. It's on the vendor list where identifiers were partially redacted. It's in the notepad scrap from the docs. Same address. Suite _ It's in a corner of one consultant invoice header, half hidden in a return address line you almost ignored because it looked like routine stationery. One suite, multiple entities. You pull a second registry page into the light, then a third. Different names, different stated purposes, different filing dates. Same building, same suite. This is the pivot. Not because shared addresses automatically mean wrongdoing. They don't. Plenty of legitimate companies use registered agents, corporate service offices, shared suites. But in this case, the address isn't just a coincidence you noticed once. It keeps showing up exactly where the record gets thin. The shadow isn't proof. The shadow is direction. Here is the system insight that turns an address into a mechanism. Corporate separateness is easy to create and extremely hard to disprove from the outside. You can form entities that look independent on paper, each with its own name, bank account, and contract. You can route payments through them as services, logistics, consulting, outreach. The public record will show vendor names and totals, but not always beneficial ownership, not always internal relationships, not always the quiet agreements that determine who really profits. And because procurement systems often vet vendors through documentation rather than deep relationship mapping, separate can remain separate as long as the paperwork behaves. You stare at the registry field labeled organizer or agent and find that parts of it are absent in your packet or reduced to a generic corporate services line. Even here, even in public filings, clarity is not guaranteed. Names can be firms. Firms can be layers. Layers can be fog. But the address stays solid. A fixed point in a moving story. You lay the registry pages on the desk like a spread of playing cards and align them with your timeline. Every time that suite appears, something else happens nearby. An approval rush, a consultant coordination meeting, a scope item duplicated under slightly different language, a protest withdrawal after a gap. You don't accuse anyone of creating a scheme. You don't claim the entities are shells. You treat the address as what it is, a convergence that makes the case legible. Because before this moment, the money trail was a maze. Now it's a corridor. You pull the record's response letter back into the light and reread the exemption categories. Proprietary commercial information, deliberative process, vendor communications, all the places where you might learn whether these entities are truly independent are precisely where the ink goes black. Redacted isn't just concealment. Redacted is a strategy. If you can't see relationships, you can't tell whether a procurement was merely rushed or quietly steered. You can't tell whether the subcontractor shuffle was operational necessity or a convenient rerouting of funds. You can't tell whether independent oversight is oversight or insulation. So you do what investigators do when a system keeps its mouth shut. You shift from story to structure. You draw a simple diagram in your notebook. At the center, the suite. Bound it. Vendor names from your subcontractor schedule. The consultant entity on the oversight agreement. The outreach PR vendor from the fragmented contracts. You circle the items that share the same return address or registered office line. You don't label it a conspiracy. You label it network candidate. Then you write 3 questions that sound boring and therefore dangerous. Who controls or services that suite? Why do vendors in separate roles cluster there? Which approvals and redactions protect those relationships from scrutiny? This is the moment the case changes meaning. Until now, you were tracking cost growth, change orders, task creep, consultant layers, subcontractor tiers. Those are common in big emergencies. But an address repeating across multiple entities that are all feeding from the same rebuild turns common into specific. It suggests the money trail might not just be messy. It might be organized enough to reuse the same mailbox. You sit back and let the rain speak for a second. Outside, the harbor looks calm because water always looks calm from a distance. On your desk, the timeline stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like a map with a legend. And the legend is one word you can't shake: sweet. A major revelation doesn't always give you the villain. Sometimes it gives you the shape of the machine. You don't find the steering wheel in the contract. You find it in the hour nobody logs. I pull the evidence object into the lamp's circle, and it immediately looks like something that was never meant to survive. A building access report printed on thin, slightly glossy paper, the kind facilities departments generate with a few clicks and a lot of reluctance. The top header is intact. The middle is clean. The bottom is where the ugliness lives. Swipe times, door names, badge, IDs, and a column that should say name, but instead carries neat black rectangles, each one redacted like a blindfold. The sheet smells faintly of overheated toner and old carpet. Someone has stapled a faded parking validation receipt to it. thermal paper curling like a dried leaf. The receipt has a timestamp. It has a garage code. It has one thing a system hates giving you: an exact minute. 12:37 a.m. You feel the timeline shift, the way a room shifts when the last honest person leaves it. You run your finger down the access log. Most entries are ordinary daytime comings and goings. Then, like a heartbeat you weren't supposed to hear, the after-midnight swipes appear in a tight cluster. 12:34 a.m. Main lobby. Las 12:36 ham. Elevator bank. 12:39 a.m. Conference corridor. Las 12:41 ham. Exec meeting room B. You look for a corresponding calendar invite in your packet. There isn't one. Not in what you have. Not in what was released. Nothing official that says, here is where we decided how this rebuild would really run. But you do have the email headers. The ones that stutter and then fall into an unaccounted interval. You have meeting minutes that say discussion held like it's an alibi. But now, pinned to the desk by a fading receipt, you have proof that somebody's feet were in the building after midnight, in the exact window where the record goes quiet. This is where the shadow gets its hands on the wheel. You're careful with your own mind. You don't jump to villains. You don't call it secret, not yet. But you call it what it is: off-calendar. And off-calendar doesn't mean illegal. It means untraceable by default. Here, the system insight that turns a midnight meeting into a mechanism. Institutions often make the real decision in the informal channel, then use the formal channel to ratify it. The formal meeting is where you record. The informal meeting is where you align. Alignment is a soft word. It sounds like teamwork. In practice, it's where constraints get negotiated and outcomes become inevitable. It's where someone says, we can't afford a delay. It's where someone else says, then don't give me a process that creates one. It's where procurement asks legal, how much can we withhold? It's where engineering says, we'll need change orders. It's where communications asks, what can we promise publicly without getting sued later? Nobody has to say, let's steer the money trail. They just have to say, let's keep this moving. And when that's the objective, the timeline becomes a weapon. You tilt the access report and follow the redacted badge IDs. One of them repeats twice in the cluster, once at 12:36, once at 1:18. A person came in, left, or moved between secure areas, and the system has scrubbed the name, leaving only the rhythm. You take the corporate registry pages from section 11 and lay them beside the access log. The shared suite address sits there like a silent witness. It doesn't connect to the building report directly, not on paper. But your instincts don't care about paper's comfort, because your packet is full of gaps, and gaps tend to rhyme. You flip to the second page of the access report and find a note at the bottom in small print. Entries may reflect contractors and visitors with temporary badges. Temporary badges. Another door. Now you see the shape of a meeting where everyone can claim plausible distance. Staff can say, we were just coordinating. Consultants can say, we were just advising. Vendors can say, we were just responding to urgent needs. And later, when costs swell and the cold case begins, Everyone can point to the official minutes and say, "We did it by the book." But the book doesn't record midnight. That's why midnight matters. You take the parking receipt and hold it closer to the light. The thermal ink is already fading at the edges. A reminder that even honest timestamps don't last forever. The receipt has a validation stamp from inside the building. That means someone expected a car to be there long enough to require it, not a quick drop-off, a meeting. You anchor it to the timeline again. Day after storm. Emergency declaration. Shortly after, emergency procurement. Then addenda. Then the thin bid field. Then the protest that died. Then the first big change orders. Then consultant oversight. Then the subcontractor shuffle. Then the suite that keeps reappearing like a fingerprint you can't officially call a fingerprint. The midnight meeting sits near the beginning of that chain, the point where a rebuild's future is still flexible enough to shape. And shaping isn't always a crime. It can be triage, but triage can also become doctrine. Doctrine can become habit. Habit can become a system that never returns to normal, even when the emergency ends. You feel the psychological cost in your own body, because you're redoing what insomnia does best, connecting dots while the rest of the city sleeps. You can sense how the people in that room might have felt too. The pressure to reopen, the fear of being blamed, the temptation to make choices now and justify them later, the comfort of redaction, the safety of saying, "We were aligned." You circle exec meeting room B and write one word beneath it, alignment. Then you underline it and add, who benefited from the alignment? Because now the case isn't just about money moving through invoices. It's about how decisions were made in the shadow, and how the record was designed so that the public could see the outcome, but not the origin. That's the kind of design that keeps a money trail alive long enough to become unrecognizable. You stack the access report on top of the withheld pages index and let the lamp burn on both. The paper doesn't confess. It never does. It just shows you what it was built to show and what it was built to hide. And tonight it shows you this. At 12:37 a.m., while the harbor slept under floodlights and salt air, the rebuild stopped being a response to damage and started being a response to incentives. And incentives, once aligned, don't like being realigned, not even by daylight. Morning is when institutions put their faces back on. They straighten their ties, publish their summaries, and call it oversight. By now your desk is a small weather system of paper, change orders that stack like tides, consultant invoices that arrive like monthly rent, subcontractor tiers that turn accountability into a hall of mirrors and that single shared suite address, sitting in the center like a quiet pulse. So when the watchdog report appears in your packet, it lands with the weight of promise. I place the evidence object under the lamp, an internal audit review document, 40-something pages, bound with a plastic comb that squeaks when you open it. The cover page is clean and official. The first paragraph is full of sober language, objective assessment, controls, compliance, risk. A gold seal is embossed in the corner, the kind of detail that makes the reader relax. You don't relax. You read the executive summary first, because that's where institutions hide their choices. The report praises responsiveness, notes documentation existed, mentions that emergency authority was appropriately invoked, recommends minor improvements, a few opportunities for future best practice, the kind of phrasing that doesn't threaten anyone's career. Then you get to the section that should make your heart quicken, scope of review, and you realize, with a slow anger that feels almost calm, that the scope is a gate. The auditors did not evaluate pricing reasonableness on specific change orders. The auditors did not review vendor relationships beyond surface compliance. The auditors did not attempt to reconstruct the unaccounted interval in communications. The auditors did not assess whether procurement requirements were structured in a way that limited competition beyond what was strictly necessary. They reviewed whether forms existed, whether approvals were recorded, whether policies were cited. They reviewed the what, not the why. Here's the system insight, the kind that makes people hate auditors and need them at the same time. Oversight often measures what is easiest to verify, not what is most important to understand, because what is easiest to verify is safe. You can verify that a signature exists. You can verify that an emergency declaration was issued. You can verify that a procurement file contains required documents. Those are checkboxes. What you can easily verify without digging into the uncomfortable parts is whether the documents reflect a healthy sense process or a process designed to look healthy. Relationship mapping is hard. Pricing analysis is tedious. Reconstructing informal decision-making requires confronting the fact that the real meeting might have happened off-calendar. So oversight agencies frequently narrow their mission to the parts that can be proven quickly and defensively. They protect their own credibility by staying inside what they can defend in a courtroom or a council hearing. The result is a report that looks rigorous and functions like a blanket. You turn pages. There are charts. There are diagrams of process flows, boxes and arrows. It all looks impressive. It also tells you something that chills you. The report's visuals are about procedure, not outcomes. The arrows show that steps happened. They do not show whether the steps mattered. You reach a paragraph about consultant oversight and feel the language gets slippery. Consultants provided additional capacity. Roles were documented. No material deficiencies noted. That phrase, "no material deficiencies," is the kind of sentence that keeps a scandal alive for years. It means nothing, and it means everything. Material to whom? Deficiency compared to what? You look for any mention of the shared suite address. Nothing. You look for any mention of Tier 2 and Tier 3 subcontracting markups. Nothing. You look for any mention of duplicated scope language across purchase orders. Nothing. You look for the protest. It appears as a footnote. A protest was filed and resolved. Resolved. The same word you've come to distrust. No discussion of the redacted debrief. No mention of the withdrawal gap. Just a bureaucratic closing eyelid. You flip to the section titled Limitations. It's there, like it always is. A legal shield disguised as humility. It says the audit relied on information provided by management. It says it did not perform forensic procedures. It says it did not evaluate fraud indicators unless specifically requested. It says it reviewed a sample, not the full population of transactions. Sample. That word is a cliff edge. A sample can miss the very thing you're hunting, especially if the thing you're hunting is concentrated in the shadows where redaction is thickest. You place the audit report next to the record's response letter and the withheld pages index, and compare them like two halves of a mask. The audit says documentation existed. The record's response says documentation is withheld. The audit says compliance controls functioned. The packet says the most relevant communications are redacted under exemptions. Both can be true. That's what makes it so ugly. A system can be compliant and compromised at the same time if compliance is defined as paperwork completeness rather than accountability completeness. A system can pass an audit if the audit's mission is to confirm the presence of forms, not the integrity of outcomes. You read a table listing controls tested. It's all verbs that sound responsible. Reviewed, confirmed, verified. You don't see verbs like traced, challenged, reconstructed. Those are forensic verbs. Those are uncomfortable verbs. You put a small, sticky note on the audit scope section and write what they didn't ask. Because the questions not asked are the space where the money trail keeps breathing. Why did vendors cluster at one suite address? Why did communications go dark during the decisive window? Why did oversight roles sit so close to vendor coordination? Why were unit rates and identifiers redacted if pricing was reasonable? Why did the protest die so cleanly? Why did the project's cost inflation feel pre-built into the contract language? The audit doesn't answer those. It doesn't even frame them. It treats the rebuild like a procedural checklist, not like a living organism responding to pressure. And that's what you feel in your bones. The watchdog didn't bark because it was never asked to. You close the report and the plastic comb creaks again like it's complaining. The lamp's light makes the glossy cover look almost holy. Oversight as theater, procurement as theater, transparency as theater. Not because everyone is lying, because the incentives reward calm. The city wants calm. The auditors want calm. The contractors want calm. The public wants calm. Calm means resolved. But you're awake at 2 a.m., and you VA learned that calm is often what happens when the truth is too expensive to examine. You push the audit report slightly back, away from the center of the desk, and you bring the access log and the corporate registry suite pages back forward. Because the case isn't about whether a report exists. It's about whether the report was designed to see the shadow. And tonight it wasn't. Procurement is supposed to be a lock. In an emergency, it becomes a curtain. You sit with the audit report still warm from the lamp, and you feel the same sensation you felt when the protest resolved itself. The system doesn't deny the existence of rules. It performs them. It makes the rules into a stage where the ending arrives right on time, and anyone who questions the script is told they don't understand the theater. I bring the evidence object into the light, and it looks like nothing until you read it. A printed excerpt from the city's procurement policy, marked up in fluorescent highlighter. Someone has underlined 3 clauses hard enough to dent the paper. In the margin, in my handwriting, a small note. Compliance can be choreography. You read the first highlighted clause, Emergency Procurement Authority. It's written in plain language, intended to save lives and restore services. It says timelines may be accelerated, competitive processes may be modified, and certain approvals may be delegated. You read the second highlighted clause, best value, not lowest cost, best value. A phrase that sounds responsible until you realize it. Flexible enough to carry almost any outcome if the evaluation criteria aren't transparent. Then the third highlighted clause, thresholds. Different dollar amounts trigger different levels of review. Below a line, a manager can approve. Above it, a committee. Above another line, public notice. Above another, council visibility. The numbers aren't inherently corrupt. They're how large organizations stay functional. But thresholds do something else too. They create lanes. And once you know the lanes, you know where the shadow likes to walk. Here's the system insight, sharp enough to cut through the polite language. Procurement can be legally compliant while still being outcome-driven, because the rules often govern steps, not intent. If the rule says obtain 3 quotes, the system can obtain 3 quotes from vendors it already knows will lose. If the rule says document rationale, the system can document rationale in a memo that arrives later with the reasoning redacted. If the rule says evaluate best value, the system can design scoring categories that reward one vendor's strengths and make everyone else look non-responsive without ever using that word. The steps are followed. The ending is protected. You trace the highlighted emergency clause back to your timeline. The storm, the declaration, the compressed bid window, the thin bidder field. It's all consistent with emergency authority. That's what makes it so hard to challenge. The same mechanism that lets a city move fast can also let it move quietly. You flip to the best value section and feel your stomach tighten, because this is where the money trail stops looking like a straight line and starts looking like a narrative choice. Best value is supposed to consider competence, schedule, safety, experience, all legitimate. But it also allows price to become only one ingredient, sometimes a minor one. In the rebuild packet, you already saw the evaluation summary without the full math. You saw the denial letter dismissed the protest with procedural calm. You saw the audit confirmed documentation existed without showing what it contained. Best value without full transparency becomes a fog machine. You turn to the threshold table and compare it to the subcontractor shuffle you mapped last night. The fragmentation makes new sense, not as a smoking gun, as a tactic the system naturally encourages. If work stays below a certain number, it stays in a faster lane. If it stays in a faster lane, fewer eyes touch it. If fewer eyes touch it, fewer questions get asked. If fewer questions get asked, the shadow has room to breathe. So even if nobody intends to game anything, the incentives make gaming feel like efficiency. You split a big scope into multiple emergency needs. You route it as task authorizations, You let the prime handle the smaller awards. You let consultants coordinate. You let oversight become a monthly invoice instead of a public argument. And when someone asks later, you point to the policy excerpt and say, "We followed the process." You stare at your own note. Compliance can be choreography. Then you pull a document from the pile that makes the concept turn into a physical feeling. A scoring rubric page, partially redacted, with category headings intact and the weight percentages blacked out. The categories are there: schedule, experience, approach, risk management. The weights are hidden. The weights are the steering wheel. Without weights, the rubric is a costume. It looks like fairness. It feels like fairness. It might even be fairness, but it cannot be verified as fairness. That's what makes a cold case like this so durable. Not the lack of paperwork, the excess of it. Paper everywhere, and still the decisive pieces arrive, redacted, or not at all. You run your finger along the black bars and think about how many legitimate reasons there are to hide certain details. Proprietary information, security, legal privilege. You can list them until sunrise, but the effect stays the same. The public cannot reconstruct the logic of the selection, and therefore cannot conclusively track the money trail back to its origin. A story is being told through documents that refuse to be complete. You write one more margin note on the procurement excerpt, slow and deliberate, when rules become performance. Accountability becomes optional. Then you add a second line. Performance rewards speed. Speed rewards incumbents. Incumbents reward networks. Networks have addresses. Addresses have suites. You glance at the corporate registry printouts again. The shared suite like a quiet drumbeat. You glance at the midnight access log. Names redacted. You glance at the protest folder, resolved and withdrawn. You can feel the case moving away from bad paperwork and toward something more structural and harder to punish. The ugly picture isn't a single illegal act you can point to. It's a set of incentives that makes a questionable outcome look like a responsible outcome if you only watch the stage and never go backstage. And the worst part is the serenity of it. The public sees a rebuilt harbor. The city sees a project delivered. The audit sees a file with the right forms. Meanwhile, your timeline shows a corridor of decisions made off calendar, explained through redacted rationale, and executed through fragmented lanes that keep scrutiny manageable. You close the procurement excerpt and tap it once against the desk, like you're knocking on a door you already know is locked. Not because there's no law, because the law is being used like lighting, bright where it comforts, dim where it would reveal the set. Influence doesn't always arrive with a suitcase of cash. Most nights, it arrives with a calendar invite. I bring the evidence object into the lamp S circle, and it looks harmless enough to be lethal. A printed calendar export. 3 pages, weak view. The kind an assistant sends when you ask who met with who. The paper is thin, corporate, and smells faintly of lemon cleaner-like. It came from an office printer that never sleeps. Whole lines have been redacted, not the meeting blocks themselves, but the details, guest lists, dial-in numbers, agenda notes. The blocks remained like silhouettes behind frosted glass. At the top, a header, Executive Schedule, Week of Rebuild Award. You trace the blocks with your finger. Community Update, Stakeholder Coordination, Port Partners Check-in, Vendor Alignment, External Relations. The language is so clean, it could polish a lie. Nothing here says lobbyist. Nothing says pressure. Nothing says deal. That's the trick. Influence likes neutral nouns. You lean closer and start doing what you always do in a cold case. You stop reading titles and start reading timing. 2 community updates appear the same day as an addendum issuance. A stakeholder check-in sits right before the bid deadline. A vendor alignment block lands in the same window as your unaccounted interval, the place in your timeline where email headers stutter and then go quiet. Then you spot the one that makes your mouth go dry. A recurring block labeled External Relations. Always 15 minutes. Always late afternoon. Always on days when approvals moved fast. The meeting titles are bland, but the pattern is not. This is where the shadow starts leaving footprints. Not heavy prints, ghost prints, calendar ghosts. I slide a second sheet beside it, because the calendar alone can be dismissed as normal outreach. The second evidence object is a lobbying disclosure excerpt, printed and highlighted. It lists registered representatives, clients, subject areas, not names you can prove are tied to wrongdoing. Just the existence of a professional influence layer operating in the same space as the rebuild. Maritime development, infrastructure funding, emergency contracting. You don't need a villain to understand what a lobbyist does. A lobbyist is a translator between money and governance. They learn who is tired, who is ambitious, who wants headlines, who wants cover. They don't always ask for illegal favors. Often they ask for access, and access is the quiet currency that purchases outcomes long before anyone signs anything. Here, the system insight that makes calendars feel like crime scenes. Corruption rarely needs explicit orders when incentives can be shaped through access and narrative. Access decides what problems get framed as urgent. Narrative decides what solutions feel responsible. Once a solution feels responsible, the process becomes a performance designed to deliver it. You look back at the calendar export and notice that several meetings are marked private. Others have their attendee lists redacted that can be legitimate. Security, privacy, ongoing negotiations. But again, the effect is what matters. The effect is a timeline that shows contact without context. So you reconstruct context from the only thing left, repetition. You flip to the 3rd page. There's a block labeled Port Business Council, recurring weekly. Under it, a block labeled Donor Reception on one night, 2 hours long, location redacted. You don't accuse anyone of trading contracts for donations. You don't get to do that. But you do write down the structural problem. When political fundraising and emergency contracting occupy the same calendar, even if separate, they share the same oxygen. People talk. People network. People remember who helped them look competent. And competence, in a crisis, is the most valuable reputation asset in the building. You pull out the press packet again, Because press releases are the public version of a calendar. You compare announcement dates to meeting blocks. Public statement about rapid mobilization lands the morning after port partners check-in. Statement about enhanced safety measures lands after stakeholder coordination. Statement about historic investment lands after external relations. It's not proof of manipulation. It's proof of choreography. The story is being managed in parallel with the contract. That's what keeps the money trail safe. If the public is soothed, scrutiny stays soft. You turn your attention back to the lobbying disclosure excerpt and note the subject categories: procurement, policy, infrastructure financing, emergency response. You underline procurement policy and think about the highlighted excerpt from Section 14, the emergency authority and best value language. Policies don't rewrite themselves. People interpret them. People decide what's necessary. People decide what's proprietary. People decide what gets redacted. And influence doesn't have to say, make it secret. Influence only has to say, we can't afford delays, and let the institution do the rest. You stare at the calendar block labeled vendor alignment and feel the words turn in your mouth like something sour. Alignment is the softest word in the file, and it keeps appearing right where your timeline hardens into suspicion. I take a pen and draw faint lines from the calendar blocks to your other artifacts, to the midnight access log, to the protest withdrawal gap, to the consultant invoices labeled coordination, to the corporate registry pages where the same suite repeats like a heartbeat. You don't have names. The system has made sure of that. But you have timing, and timing is often the only honest witness left when everything else is redacted. You notice one final detail. A short meeting labeled Call with Counsel, 10 minutes, directly preceding a batch of redactions in the record's response. It might be routine legal review. It might be prudent. It might be nothing. But it tells you something important about the machine. Secrecy is not accidental. It is reviewed. It is approved. It is part of the workflow. That's the moment you feel the psychological cost hit. Not anger, not despair. Something colder. The realization that accountability isn't missing because nobody thought of it. It's missing because it was negotiated against urgency, against politics, against the need to keep moving. You set the calendar pages down and look at your desk as a whole. A harbor rebuild that looks like a miracle in daylight. A cold case that looks like a system at night. A money trail that doesn't scream, doesn't even whisper, but keeps tapping its fingers through patterns. Who met, when they met, what got said publicly afterward, and what got blacked out before anyone could ask the wrong question. You lean in, lower your voice without meaning to, because the next part isn't about whether someone broke the law. It's about whether the law was used like a lantern, pointed away from the shadow. And once you see that, you realize the calendar isn't just scheduling. It's architecture. There's a kind of fraud that doesn't need lies. It only needs two meanings that can sit in the same sentence without touching. You bring the lamp closer, and I slide the evidence object into the circle like it's radioactive, an invoice packet in a clear plastic sleeve. The kind accountants use when they want paper to survive coffee, rain, and denial. The top sheet is labeled Pay, Application, Summary, Stamped Received, with a signature at the bottom that looks confident enough to be dangerous. Under it, a contractor invoice. Under that, a subcontractor invoice. Under that, a set of daily field tickets, each one with a date, a crew count, a piece of equipment listed like a character in a play. The plastic sleeve squeaks when you pull the papers out. The ink smells faintly sharp, and your fingertips pick up a grit that could be harbored dust, or just old bureaucracy ground into pulp. You start with the total. It's clean, rounded, the kind of number that makes a council member nod. Then you look for how the number was built. And that's where the invoice tells two stories. Story one is the public story, the tidy story. It sits at the top, inside a box, formatted like certainty. Amount due, retainage, previous payments. This period, the numbers balance, the math behaves. It looks like the kind of document a system can point to and say, everything's accounted for. Story 2 lives underneath, in the line items and attachments where meaning starts to blur. Standby, mobilization, coordination, management, overtime differential, material handling. None of those words are illegal. None of them are automatically wrong. They are also the kind of words that can swallow a budget if nobody asks what they mean in practice. You turn to the daily field tickets. One ticket lists a crane on standby for 6 hours. Another lists a crew delayed due to site access. Another lists a truck dispatch that matches the same shift window as the notepad note from the docks. Same trucks, different company name on the slip. You don't have the slip itself, not yet, but the time stamps rhyme, and in a cold case, rhymes are clues. Then you notice a detail you've seen too many times to ignore. The unit rates are partially redacted, not all of them. Just the ones that would let a normal person compare reasonable to inflated. The quantities are visible. The categories are visible. The rates, the teeth of the invoice, are hidden behind clean black rectangles. Redacted again. You flip back to the pay application summary. It certifies that the work was performed. It certifies that the costs are accurate. It certifies compliance. The signature makes it official. The redactions make it impossible to verify. Here's the system insight, the one that turns billing into a quiet weapon. Most payment systems run on certified statements and trust-based controls, because verifying everything would stop the project. In emergency builds, the owner relies on the prime's pay application, the consultant's review, and a process that samples rather than exhausts. The audit looks for forms. The consultant looks for completeness. The city looks for reopening. Everyone's incentives lean toward approve, unless something is loud enough to force pause. And the clever part is that nothing here has to be loud. You compare the prime invoice to a subcontractor invoice behind it. Both include mobilization. Both include coordination. Both include site security support. In slightly different words, that doesn't prove double billing. It could be separate mobilizations, separate coordination, separate security scopes, but the language is soft enough that two charges can coexist without ever being called duplicates. You check the remittance addresses at the bottom of the invoices. One is a standard corporate P.O. box. Another is a street address with a suite number. Your pen stops. It's the suite again. Not the exact same entity name as your registry printouts, but the address repeats, a quiet echo. It could be a legitimate back office, a registered agent, a mailroom serving multiple firms. Still, it pulls the case tighter. It ties the vendor constellation back to a single physical point where paperwork gathers before it becomes money. You place the invoice packet beside your corporate registry pages and your calendar export and feel the shadow thicken. The system docenti need a hidden bank transfer. If it can route value through categories nobody can easily define, under rates nobody can easily see, through entities that appear separate while sharing the same coordinates. You move to the equipment lines. A specific model number appears on two different tickets. Same day, same hours, different billing categories. One lists it as equipment standby, another as operational support. It might be a clerical artifact, a copy-paste mistake, a rushed admin trying to keep up with a moving job. Or it might be the invoices to stories. Again, one story is what happened, another is what the system can successfully bill. You don't accuse. You build the timeline. You lay the tickets in order and match them to your earlier unaccounted interval. The heaviest billing categories spike right after the midnight access log cluster, right after alignment meetings, right after the protest evaporates. The paperwork behaves like a machine that has been pointed in a direction and told to keep moving. You feel it in your chest, the case ISNT asking you to find a single lie. It asking you to see how a system can remain technically compliant while it drains value through ambiguity. That's the rot. Not blood, not gore, rot in ink. You circle the redacted unit rates and write a note in the margin of your notebook. Two truths, paid versus proven, because payment is not proof. Payment is what happens when the system's incentives agree that friction is too expensive. Do you read the signature block again? A name might be there in a full packet. Here it's a role, a title, a system that can replace people and keep the shadow intact. The harbor gets rebuilt. That part is visible. The invoices claim the harbor got rebuilt. That's also visible. What's hidden is the precise cost of each step and the relationships that set those costs. Redacted rates, shared suites, calendar ghosts, a midnight room, a protest withdrawal, bar, and now sitting in your hands. An invoice that balances perfectly while refusing to tell you what it really means. You place it back into the plastic sleeve and seal it like evidence, because that's what it is. Not a confession, a pressure point. A place where the money trail is forced to touch paper. A place where the cold case can stop being about vibes and start being about arithmetic. The system docenti want you to do. And when you look at the timeline, you realize the next question isn't, did they bill too much? It's sharper. Who made sure the billing could never be fully understood? Put the cleanest money wears a lapel pin. You've been living in invoices and redactions long enough that you can feel when the case wants to jump tracks. Construction dollars are loud, even when they're obscured. Politics is quieter. Politics is where the same dollar can buy nothing on paper and everything in practice. I bring the evidence object into the LAMP-S circle, and it looks almost embarrassing in its simplicity. A stapled stack of campaign finance filings printed from a public portal, plus a folded fundraiser invitation card. That S been handled so much, the crease is starting to tear. The filing pages are dense with line items, dates, committee codes, and contribution amounts. The invitation is glossy and polite. It thanks you for supporting leadership. It lists a time window, a venue name, and, in the corner, a small line that turns your stomach tight. Hosted by Friends of the Waterfront. No names on the invite. Or rather, the names are there, but they've been partially redacted in your packet, reduced to initials and host committee. That's the word you keep seeing. Redacted, like the city thinks the public is allergic to context. You lay the filings flat and start reading them like you read an invoice, because in this cold case, the timeline is the only witness that doesn't get tired. Contribution date, amount, contributor, employer or business name, sometimes included, sometimes not. Address, that last field is where your eyes slow down, because your brain is already trained by the sweet. You see it again. Not every line. Not enough to declare anything, but enough to feel the shadow move when the lamp hits it. The same building, the same street, the same sweet number that kept appearing in corporate registry pages and remittance addresses. Here, it's attached to a consulting entity. There, it's attached to a community outreach firm. A few lines later, it's attached to a donor name that looks like a person on paper, but could be an officer of an LLC in practice. In public finance records, this isn't rare. Registered agents, shared offices, corporate service providers, all common. You don't turn it into a headline. In a real dossier, you don't get to do that. But you do what the system hates most. You align the dates. You match the contribution dates to your procurement timeline. One cluster lands in the same month as the contract award. Another lands right after the bid protest evaporates. A third lands right as the first wave of change orders begins to swell. Then a smaller cluster appears after the audit report is issued, like a soft exhale. Again, none of this is proof of quid pro quo. Public contributions can be legal, ordinary, even ideological. But a cold case doesn't require you to prove a bribe, to reveal an incentive structure. It requires you to show how the machine creates a channel where gratitude can flow alongside contracts without ever touching the same document. Here, as the system, insight that makes campaign filings feel like fingerprints left in fog. Political money rarely purchases a specific decision in the open. It purchases access, narrative control, and the benefit of the doubt. Access means your call gets returned. Narrative control means your project gets framed as urgent, job-saving, critical. Benefit of the doubt means when a question comes, it's answered gently, or late, or with a redaction that turns scrutiny into fatigue. And in an emergency rebuild, fatigue is the most valuable resource the system can manufacture. If people are too tired to keep asking, the money trail gets to keep moving. You glance back at the fundraiser invite and the phrase, "Friends of the Waterfront." It's not illegal. It's not even necessarily connected to the contract. It's the kind of civic branding that can be sincere. But branding does something specific. It turns a policy decision into a community story. Once something is a community story, questioning it becomes socially expensive. You're no longer challenging a procurement file. You're undermining recovery. You're attacking jobs. You're politicizing tragedy. That's how the shadow keeps itself warm. You flip to another page in the filing stack and find an in-kind contribution. Entry, venue, catering, printing, all the soft materials of influence. Then you find an entry that's more interesting because it's more ambiguous. Consulting services, value listed, description vague. It could be compliance help. It could be communications advice. It could be perfectly legitimate. It could also be the kind of support that teaches an institution how to sound clean while staying unexplainable. You pull your calendar export from Section 15 and place it beside the donor filings. You don't need names. You need overlaps. External relations, 15 minutes, repeating, community update, placed before key procurement milestones. Call with counsel, just before redactions intensify. Then you look down at the contribution dates again and feel the timeline tighten into a rope. A system doesn't need to promise anything. A system only needs to make certain people feel welcome, listened to, protected from inconvenience. That's enough to tilt decisions without ever writing the tilt down. You think about the audit's scope, what it didn't ask. You think about the scoring rubric weights, blacked out. You think about the protest debrief, redacted. You think about the invoice unit rates, redacted. It's a pattern of governance that isn't a scandal until it's too late to reverse. You circle one donor entry and stare at the address line until it becomes less an address and more a symbol. The suite again, a mailbox that seems to hold too many identities. A point where corporate separateness can live comfortably while money moves through paperwork that always balances. And you feel the psychological cost, the one nobody writes into budgets, the slow realization that the public record is designed to show you legality, not truth. You write a note to yourself on a blank corner of the filing. Parallel rails. Rail 1. Contract dollars. Change orders. Pay apps. Rail 2. Political money. Access. Events. Gratitude. The rails don't have to cross on paper to carry the same train. The ugliness you can finally name without accusing anyone of a specific crime. The system is built so that public work and public politics can share the same oxygen while pretending they breathe different air. You stack the filings back together and the staples bite your thumb. Tiny pain, honest. You look at your desk and realize how far the case has moved from a broken harbor wall. This cold case is now about the architecture of influence. What gets redacted, what gets labeled resolved, what gets called best value, and who gets invited into the rooms where alignment happens after midnight. You lean closer to the lamp, quieter now, because you know what comes next. When money and access start to rhyme, Someone always tries to break the rhyme. Someone always almost speaks. You always imagine the truth arriving like a door kicked open. Most nights it arrives like a hand hovering over send, then pulling back at the last second. I slide the evidence object into the lamp. Circle. And it looks too ordinary to be dangerous. A printout of an internal hotline intake summary. 2 pages, stapled, with a reference number at the top, and a line that reads, "Confidential," in bold. The text is mostly intact, but the identifying fields are blacked out so heavily the paper looks bruised. Redacted name, redacted department, redacted contact method. Even the date is partially obscured, leaving only the time window and a soft mention of during award week. Someone wanted to speak. Someone also wanted to survive. You read the narrative portion, the part the system can quite sterilize, because it needs a complaint to justify its own process. It's written in plain, tired language, not a manifesto, not a threat, just a person pointing at a pattern and hoping the machine will recognize it as a problem. They mention vendor overlap. They mention the same suite address appearing across entities. They mention mobilization and coordination lines that feel duplicated. They mention after-hours alignment that wasn't logged in calendars. They mention pressure to move faster than documentation could keep up. They mention a fear that if they attach their name, they'll be reassigned, sidelined, or slowly starved of influence. And then, in one sentence, that makes your stomach tighten. They write, "I don't want to be the reason the harbor stays closed." That's the hostage note every emergency creates. A moral trap built from urgency. It's how a shadow keeps its shape without ever raising its voice. You flip the second page. It lists the intake classification, procurement concern, potential conflict of interest, referred to management for review. It's that last phrase that makes you sit up, referred to management. You've been awake long enough to know what that means in practice. It doesn't mean the complaint is ignored. It means the complaint is returned to the very environment it's complaining about, wrapped in confidentiality and softened language, so the institution can say it addressed the issue without ever letting it become public. Here's the system insight that makes whistleblower channels feel like padded rooms. Internal reporting systems often exist to manage institutional risk as much as they exist to reveal truth. They triage, they categorize, they assign, they protect confidentiality. Yes, they also protect reputations. They decide what is substantiated, what is unfounded, what is insufficient information. They can close a case cleanly without ever answering the question you care about. Did the money trail move in a way that served the public, or in a way that served the network? You pick up the hotline summary and place it beside your audit report. What they didn't ask. You feel the alignment between them like a pressure change. The audit avoided relationship mapping. The hotline report is about relationships. So what happens when someone tries to force the system to look at the relationships anyway? The system does what systems do. It processes. Processing is the polite cousin of burying. It's slower, cleaner, safer. I've seen it in other cold case files. The kind that get written about years later, when nobody can remember who made the choice. First, the complaint becomes an allegation. Then it becomes a concern. Then it becomes a matter. Then it becomes closed. You notice a line in the intake summary, records preserved per retention policy. That sounds responsible. It also gives the institution an exit. Retention policies can be short for certain communications. Some channels vanish by default: chat messages, temporary badges, meeting notes on personal pads, drafts that never get saved to the official folder. The timeline becomes a sieve, and later everyone says, honestly, we don't have that. You turn the paper and look for a resolution note. There is one, brief and bloodless, reviewed procurement file. No policy violation identified. Recommendations: reinforce documentation standards. No policy violation identified. That sentence isn't a conclusion. It's a boundary. It says, we looked for what the policy defines as wrongdoing, and we didn't find it. It does not say the outcome was healthy. It does not say the incentives weren't warped. It does not say the shadow wasn't there. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the person behind the black bars. Not a hero, not a cartoon whistleblower, just someone with a mortgage and a badge and a sense that the case was slipping into the kind of fog that becomes permanent. You imagine them watching their complaint enter the machine. The machine replies with politeness. Then the machine changes the temperature around them. Not a firing that would be messy. A reassignment framed as support. A request to route concerns through proper channels, which is funny because they did. A sudden meeting about team cohesion. A reminder about confidentiality. Maybe even an offer to sign something that feels like protection but behaves like a muzzle. You don't have those details in the packet. You don't invent them. You only explain why fear is rational. Because future access is the true currency on the docks and in the office towers. A person can be protected on paper and punished in atmosphere. You look at your desk and see how the system learned to keep its hands clean. Redacted names, redacted attendees, redacted unit rates, an audit that tests forms, a hotline that tests policy language, a protest that resolved, a calendar full of ghosts, a sweet address that keeps showing up like it's laughing quietly. The whistleblower didn't bring a smoking gun. They brought a map. And the institution responded by folding the map into its pocket and calling it addressed. You feel the psychological cost settle in. Not despair, something more precise. The understanding that truth is not only resisted by bad actors, it's resisted by design, by the very mechanisms meant to handle it safely. The same mechanisms that keep a city functioning also keep it from staring directly into its own shadow. You tap the hotline reference number with your fingertip and let the lamp hold it in harsh light. This is the moment the case becomes personal without ever naming a person. Someone tried to surface the missing names behind the redacted timeline, and the system responded the way it always does when an accusation threatens momentum. It softened it, it contained it, it filed it, and it moved on. You lean forward and write one sentence in your notebook, slow and certain. When the truth can't become evidence, it becomes atmosphere. That's what you're breathing now. The next step is not chasing another rumor. It's assembling what you already have into a final shape, strong enough to stand in daylight. A synthesis that doesn't require a confession to be convincing, because it shows the pattern across documents, across dates, across incentives, across the money trail itself. You look at the harbor map again, damp edges curling, and you realize the case is ready to close its fist. Not with a name, with a machine. You've been living inside fragments long enough that you can feel the case begging for a single sentence. Not a conclusion you can sue. Not a villain you can point at. A shape you can't unsee. I drag the evidence object into the lamp's circle, and it takes both hands, because it isn't one document. It's a stitched ledger I made from everything you've touched tonight. A long strip of paper taped end-to-end, dates down the left margin, dollar amounts down the right, and in the middle, the quiet verbs that move the world. Approved, aligned, issued, withdrawn, certified, withheld, redacted, redacted, redacted. You lean over it, and the smell of tape adhesive mixes with old ink, and suddenly the harbor rebuild stops being a pile of paperwork and becomes a timeline you can hear ticking. It starts the morning after the storm. Emergency authority invoked. The reason is real. The need is real. The urgency is real. Then the procurement lane narrows. Shortened windows, addenda, a thin bidder field. A competitor marked non-responsive on a technicality that might be fair and might be brutal and might be both at the same time. The best value language stands there like a friendly bouncer, letting some people in and turning others away without ever admitting it's doing triage. And right where the story should be loudest, right where the debate should be visible, the record goes soft. You see it in the email headers that stutter and then fall into an unaccounted interval. You see it in the meeting minutes that say discussion held without saying whose throat got dry in the room. You see it in the midnight access log, names masked, badge IDs ghosting through doors after 12:30 a.m., like the building itself had insomnia. That's when the case changes, because you can't prove what was said, but you can prove when the shadow had time to speak. After that, the contract award feels less like a decision and more like an outcome already prepped to arrive. Optional extensions. Additional task authorizations, elastic language that makes final price a bedtime story. Then the money trail begins to behave like a tide. Change orders arrive. One, then another, then a rhythm. Unforeseen conditions. Schedule recovery. Material constraints. Words that can be true and still be useful. Attachments partially withheld, just enough to keep a public reader from checking the math without specialized access. A consultant layer blooms around the project, billed as independent oversight but functioning. At minimum, as additional capacity, and at maximum, as insulation. Their invoices talk about coordination and risk mitigation, and their memos, if they exist, are the kind of thing that can disappear behind deliberative exemptions. Oversight becomes a monthly expense instead of a public argument. Then the protest appears, tries to make noise, and dies quietly. Resolve, no further action, withdrawn. The debrief that should explain the decision arrives redacted, like an apology written with a blindfold. And as the rebuild continues, the spending fractures, subcontractor tiers, Tier 2, Tier 3. Scope phrases that change outfits depending on the document. Haul-off becomes disposal, becomes clearing support. The same trucks, different company on the slip, according to a scrap of paper from the docks that doesn't have a logo. Only a human hand pressing too hard on a pen. This is what a cold case looks like when it's made of process rather than violence. Not one body, many small disappearances. A missing minute, a missing name, a missing unit rate. You follow those disappearances, and the case gives you a coordinate, the shared suite address. It turns up in corporate registry printouts, in vendor paperwork, in remittance lines, in places where separate entities should have separate gravity. None of it is proof of a scheme, but it is proof of convergence, and convergence is how you turn fog into a map. Then you find the public calm, the audit report, clean, professional, comforting, and inside it, the quiet confession of scope. It tested for forms and policy citations, not for relationships, not for pricing reasonableness, not for the unaccounted interval where alignment happened after midnight. The watchdog didn't miss the shadow. It wasn't asked to look at it. The calendar exports add their own ghosts. External relations, community updates, stakeholder coordination, blocks of time with details shaved off, influence in neutral nouns. A world where access doesn't need to demand anything. It only needs to be present often enough that doubt feels inconvenient. And then the politics, running on parallel rails, public campaign filings, a fundraiser invite that smells like carpeted banquet rooms and soft laughter, contributions that may be legal and ordinary but that overlap with the procurement timeline closely enough to raise the only honest question you're allowed to ask. Does gratitude travel near the rebuild, even if it never touches it on paper? Finally, the hotline summary, a near whistle, a person describing the same patterns you've been circling, vendor overlap, suite convergence, duplicated billing categories, off-calendar alignment. The system's reply is calm and terminal. No policy violation identified. Recommendation, document better. Translation, the machine recognizes risk and chooses containment. Here's the system insight, the one that makes the whole stitched ledger feel heavier than the harbor itself. A bureaucracy can produce a legally defensible record that still fails the public interest, because its incentives reward deliverables, not truth. Deliverables are reopened docs, TOM press releases, closed complaints, clean audits, timely approvals. Truth is slower. Truth is messy. Truth forces you to stare at the relationships between vendors and reviewers, between policy, language, and outcomes, between redaction and accountability. Truth risks delay. Truth risks headlines. Truth risks careers. So the system chooses what it can survive. You stare at your stitched timeline and realize you're not looking at a single bad decision. You're looking at a cascade where each step is individually justifiable, and the total is something nobody wants to own. Emergency authority narrows competition. Narrow competition increases dependence on incumbents. Dependence makes change orders feel unavoidable. Change orders create a second market with softer scrutiny. Consultant layers dilute responsibility. Subcontractor tiers fragment spending. Redactions protects rationale. Audits verify paperwork. Complaints get processed. The harbor reopens. The shadow keeps its job. You don't get to end a real dossier by declaring a culprit. But you can end this section by stating the synthesis that the records themselves have earned. The harbor rebuild can be both real recovery and a money trail, and the difference between the two lives inside what the timeline won't show you without force. You press your palm down on the taped ledger and feel the edge of the last page curl up like it wants to turn itself. Because the only thing left now is the final question. The one Section 20 will not dodge. What remains in the dark when the harbor looks fine in daylight? Reach the end of a file like this the way you reach the end of a long night. Not with relief, with a kind of bruised clarity. The harbor exists. The storm happened. The rebuild occurred. People went back to work. Ships returned. The lights came back on. That's the part everyone wants to keep, and you should. Recovery matters. Public systems are allowed to be urgent. They are allowed to move. What they are not allowed to do, at least not without consequence, is turn urgency into a permanent excuse for shadows. I place the evidence object at the center of the desk one last time. A single page labeled Closeout Checklist, stamped Final, with boxes checked in tidy ink. There's a signature line at the bottom, Roll Only, Name Withheld. A small paragraph at the top announces the project substantially complete and praises exceptional interagency cooperation. The paper is immaculate. That's what makes it terrifying. Because closeout checklists don't measure what the public feels in its gut. They measure what a system can survive on paper. They confirm deliverables. They confirm documentation exists. They confirm the file can be shelved. And shelving is what turns living accountability into a cold case. You read the checklist boxes and think about what they don't include. Confirm bid field reflected maximum feasible competition. Confirm evaluation weights are publicly verifiable. Confirm vendor network relationships were disclosed and reviewed. Confirm unit rates are available for public reasonableness checks. Confirm off-calendar alignment. Meetings were documented. None of those are boxes. None of those are required to call it complete. Here's the final system insight, the one that explains why a rebuilt harbor can still leave a stain. Public institutions are optimized to finish projects, not to prove innocence. Finishing is tangible. It's concrete and steel and ribbon cuttings. Proving innocence requires transparency deep enough to show not just what happened, but why it happened, who influenced it, and how the incentives shaped every reasonable decision into a single direction. That kind of transparency is expensive. It slows things down. It risks reputations. So the system tends to offer a substitute: compliance. Compliance is the checklist. Truth is the timeline. You separate the two in your mind, because this is a real dossier, and you have to be honest about the boundary between what can be proven and what can only be inferred. What can be proven from the public record you held tonight? The rebuild was executed under emergency authority with compressed timelines. Competition was limited, the bid field thin, and a competitor was marked non-responsive on technical grounds. Key evaluation details and rationale were not fully visible in released materials, with redactions and omissions concentrated around communications and vendor coordination. The contract structure included elastic mechanisms, optional extensions, additional task authorizations, and change orders that arrived quickly and clustered after periods of missing documentation. Consultant oversight existed, billed as independent capacity, while much of the substantive why behind decisions remained outside public view. Spending fragmented through subcontractor tiers, with scope described variably across documents, and certain identifiers and unit rates redacted. A bid protest occurred and concluded quietly through denial and withdrawal, with the debrief materials heavily redacted. A shared suite address appeared repeatedly across multiple entities in filings and paperwork, indicating convergence even if the underlying relationships cannot be fully established from the available record. After-hours access activity occurred in a key window, with identities redacted, aligning with a broader pattern of unaccounted intervals in the communication timeline. Internal complaint mechanisms recorded concerns and closed them within a policy framework, reinforcing documentation rather than exposing relationships. Those are facts, or at least the closest thing to facts the packet allowed. What can only be inferred responsibly is the thing you've been feeling since Section 1. That the rebuild's money trail was protected by design, not necessarily by one criminal act, but by a system that makes it difficult to understand relationships, pricing, and persuasion once urgency is declared. That's the shadow you're left with, not a named culprit. A set of incentives and methods that keeps outcomes defensible and origins obscured. So the resolution, in this kind of noir, isn't a gavel slam. It's a list of what remains in the dark, and what it would take to drag it out without burning the city down in the process. What remains in the dark? Who attended the off-calendar alignment moment, and what decisions were made there? What the redacted unit rates and withheld attachments would reveal about pricing reasonableness and duplicated categories. Whether the repeated suite address represents ordinary registered agent clustering or a coordinated vendor network benefiting from fragmentation. How influence operated through access, narrative, and political proximity, even if no illegal exchange can be shown on paper. Whether the protest withdrawal involved pure legal calculus, institutional pressure, or a quiet off-ramp into the subcontractor ecosystem. And the most corrosive, unanswered question of all, did the system ever truly want this to be knowable? If you want the case to mean something beyond insomnia and ink, you end with reform that doesn't require a miracle, just a refusal to let emergency become permanent. The practical reforms that would change the next rebuild without pretending corruption is the only danger. Publish full evaluation, scoring, and weights after award. with narrow redactions only where truly necessary. Mandate relationship disclosures for prime and key subs, including shared offices, registered agents, and beneficial ownership where feasible. Require change order reasonableness checks and public summaries of the cost basis, including unit rate ranges. Trigger enhanced review when fragmented awards collectively exceed thresholds, so splitting work doesn't split accountability. Log after-hours, access, and off-calendar alignment in a minimal public record date. Attendees by role, topics, decisions. Not everything, just enough. Move hotline complaints about procurement and conflicts to an independent reviewer by default, rather than referred to management. Audit the uncomfortable verbs, trace, reconstruct, challenge, not just verify, confirm, review. None of this accuses anyone. It accuses the machine. And tonight, that's the only accusation you can make without lying. You look at the closeout checklist again. The word final stamped like a spell. And you understand what Neuer always understands. Final is what institutions call it when they want the public to stop asking. But you and I know better. A harbor rebuild deal doesn't end when the concrete dries. It ends when the public can look at the timeline and understand how their money moved without needing to stay awake until 2 a.m. to decode it. You turn the desk lamp slightly away from the checklist and back toward the taped ledger you made, because that's where the truth still lives, even if it's incomplete. Outside, the rain is lighter now. The harbor is quiet. The city will wake up and walk across new pavement, grateful, forgetting the shadow that paid for it. You don't forget. You file the dossier anyway, not as a verdict, as a warning.